Welcome to Reading Bear. Today, we've got a story where OP's HOA president threatens to tow his truck from his own driveway. OP's malicious compliance is absolutely brilliant. I never thought I'd be one of those people writing about HOA drama, but here we are. This whole mess started about 6 months after my wife and I moved into what we thought was our dream house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was perfect. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a decent-sized yard, and most importantly, it was ours. What we didn't fully appreciate at the time was just how much our HOA president would come to regret his power-hungry attitude. Let me set the scene first. Our neighborhood is one of those cookie-cutter developments built in the early 2000s, with about 40 houses arranged in a neat little grid. Nothing fancy, just middle-class families trying to live their lives. The HOA was supposed to be pretty minimal. Keep the common areas maintained, make sure people don't paint their houses neon pink, that sort of thing. The monthly dues were reasonable, and the covenants seemed straightforward when we read through them before buying. I work as a contractor, mostly residential electrical work, some plumbing when needed. It's honest work that pays the bills and lets me be my own boss. For my business, I drive a 2018 Ford F250, white with my company name and phone number painted on the sides. Nothing flashy, just a clean, professional-looking work truck that I keep in good condition. It's got my tools in the back, extension ladders on the rack, and all the equipment I need to do my job properly. When we first moved in, I parked the truck in our driveway every night, just like any normal person would park their vehicle. Our driveway is plenty long enough. It can fit 3 cars easily, and the truck only took up about half of it. The property line is clearly marked, and the driveway is definitely within our lot boundaries. I'd checked the survey when we bought the house to make sure everything was legit. For the first few months, everything was fine. The neighbors were friendly enough, waving when they saw us outside, chatting about the weather and local sports teams. My wife got along great with the lady next door, and we even had a couple of barbecues with some of the folks on our street. I honestly thought we lucked out with a drama-free neighborhood. That changed when I met our HOA president. This guy, let's call him Mr. Power Trip since I'm keeping names out of this, lived about 4 houses down from us. He was probably in his early 60s, retired from some middle management position that he clearly missed dearly. You know the type. Guy who spent 40 years bossing people around in an office and couldn't let go of that feeling when he stopped working. He'd found a new outlet for his control issues by running the HOA like his personal fiefdom. The first time I encountered him was on a Saturday morning when I was washing my truck in the driveway. I'd just finished a big job and wanted to clean off a week's worth of job site dust before starting my weekend. I was minding my own business, music playing softly from a Bluetooth speaker, when this guy walks up to my property line. He didn't introduce himself or say hello. Instead, he stood there for a good 30 seconds just staring at my truck like it had personally offended him. Finally, he cleared his throat and asked if I was the new owner. When I confirmed that yes, my wife and I had bought the house a few months ago, he launched into this whole speech about neighborhood standards and property values. The gist of his complaint was that my work truck was an eyesore that didn't belong in a residential neighborhood. He went on and on about how the neighborhood had a certain image to maintain, and how commercial vehicles parked in driveways made the whole area look unprofessional. I listened politely, figured this was just an old guy being grumpy, and explained that the truck was my daily driver and my livelihood. I thought that would be the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Power Trip made it his personal mission to hassle me about my truck. He'd walk by our house multiple times a day, which was weird since his house was in the opposite direction from the neighborhood entrance, and always find some reason to stop and stare. Sometimes he'd take pictures with his phone. Other times he'd just stand there shaking his head like I was running a meth lab or something. My wife started getting annoyed too. She'd be working in our front garden, which she'd been putting a lot of effort into, and this guy would walk by and make passive-aggressive comments about how nice it would look if not for the unsightly vehicle in the driveway. She's usually pretty patient with difficult people, but even she was getting fed up with his attitude. Things escalated when I started getting official letters from the HOA. The first one came about a month after my initial encounter with Mr. Power Trip. It was printed on fancy letterhead and written in this formal, legal-sounding language that was clearly meant to intimidate. The letter stated that my commercial vehicle was in violation of the neighborhood covenants and needed to be relocated immediately. I was pretty confused by this since I'd read through all the HOA documents when we bought the house. I dug out my copy of the covenants and read through them again carefully. There was a section about not operating businesses from residential properties, and another part about not storing commercial equipment in yards or common areas. But nothing that I could find specifically prohibited parking a work vehicle in your own driveway. I decided to call the management company that handled our HOA to get some clarification. The woman I spoke with was actually pretty helpful. She explained that the covenant about business operations was mainly to prevent people from turning their houses into offices or warehouses, and the equipment storage rule was to keep people from leaving construction materials and heavy machinery scattered around their yards. When I asked specifically about work trucks, she said it was a gray area that different HOAs handled differently. Some prohibited them entirely, others allowed them as long as they were properly maintained and not used for storage of hazardous materials. She suggested I attend the next HOA meeting to discuss it with the board. The monthly HOA meeting was held at the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed the mailboxes and a little playground. I'd never been to one before, but I figured it would be a good chance to clear the air and find a reasonable solution. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. The meeting was attended by about 15 people, mostly older residents who didn't seem to have much else going on. Mr. Powertrip ran the meeting like he was chairing a corporate board, complete with formal parliamentary procedure and a printed agenda. Most of the business was incredibly mundane stuff: approving the landscaping budget, discussing some minor repairs to the playground equipment, voting on new mulch for the flower beds. When we got to new business, I raised my hand and asked to speak about the truck issue. Mr. Powertrip got this satisfied look on his face, like he'd been waiting for this moment. He let me explain my situation and my interpretation of the covenants, nodding along in a way that was clearly just for show. Then he launched into his response. According to him, my truck was absolutely a violation of multiple HOA rules. He claimed it fell under the business operation prohibition because I used it for commercial purposes. He said it violated the aesthetic standards because it had company graphics on the side. He even argued that it was a safety hazard because it was larger than a typical passenger vehicle. But here's the kicker, he said the HOA had the right to have any vehicle towed from the community if it violated the covenants, even if it was parked on private property. He cited some obscure clause about the HOA's authority to enforce compliance and claimed they could take action to protect property values. I tried to argue my point, explaining that the truck was legally registered, properly insured, and parked entirely on my own property. Several other residents seemed to be on my side. One guy mentioned that his neighbor had a company car with logos on it, and another woman pointed out that plenty of people in the neighborhood had boats, RVs, and other large vehicles in their driveways. But Mr. Powertrip had clearly stacked the board with his cronies. When they took a vote on whether to pursue enforcement action against me, it passed 4-1. The one dissenting vote came from a younger woman who seemed as frustrated with the whole situation as I was. After the meeting, Mr. Powertrip made a point of coming up to me with this smug smile on his face. He handed me another official letter, already prepared, that gave me 30 days to remove the truck from the neighborhood permanently or face towing and fines. That's when I realized this guy wasn't interested in reasonable compromise. He decided to make an example out of me, probably to show the whole neighborhood who was in charge. The letter made it clear that he considered any work truck to be prohibited, regardless of where it was parked or how well maintained it was. I spent the next few days researching HOA law and talking to other contractors I knew who lived in similar neighborhoods. Most of them had dealt with some version of this issue, and the general consensus was that HOAs could be pretty aggressive about enforcement, even when their interpretation of the rules was questionable. But I also learned something interesting. In our state, HOAs have to follow specific procedures for enforcement actions. They can't just arbitrarily tow vehicles or impose fines without proper notice and appeals processes. And most importantly, they can only enforce rules that are clearly stated in the recorded covenants, not arbitrary interpretations or new policies. I decided to fight this thing properly. I hired a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, not cheap, but I wasn't going to let some retired middle manager bully me out of parking my own vehicle on my own property. My lawyer reviewed the covenants and confirmed what I'd suspected. There was no clear prohibition against work trucks. The business operation clause specifically mentioned conducting business activities and operating commercial enterprises, which clearly referred to using your house as an office or storing business inventory, not simply owning a work vehicle. We sent a formal response to the HOA, explaining why their interpretation was incorrect and demanding they withdraw the enforcement action. We also requested copies of all their communications about my truck and any similar cases they'd handled in the past. Mr. Powertrip's response was to double down. Instead of backing off, he sent another letter claiming that my lawyer's involvement proved I was operating a business from my home and strengthening their case. He also started getting more aggressive with his enforcement threats. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I was getting ready to head out to a job site. I walked outside to find Mr. Powertrip standing in my driveway with his phone out, taking pictures of my truck from every angle. When he saw me coming, he didn't back away or apologize for being on my property without permission. Instead, he informed me that he was documenting violations for the next HOA board meeting and that I should expect formal towing action within the week. He said the board had authorized him to contract with a local towing company and that my truck would be removed regardless of where it was parked. That's when he made the mistake that would lead to his downfall. He told me that the only way to avoid having my truck towed was to park it completely off the neighborhood property, not just off the street, but entirely outside the community boundaries. According to him, the HOA covenants gave them authority over all visible vehicles within the neighborhood, even on private property. I asked him to clarify exactly what he meant by that. He said that if I wanted to keep my truck, I needed to find somewhere else to park it, maybe rent a space at a commercial lot or park it at a relative's house outside the neighborhood. As long as it was visible from any street or common area within the community, it was subject to HOA enforcement. Now, I knew this was complete nonsense. HOAs can't control what you park on your own property as long as it's legal and not actually violating clear covenant restrictions. But Mr. Powertrip was so confident in his authority that he put this ridiculous demand in writing. He handed me yet another official letter, signed by him as HOA president, stating that all commercial vehicles must be parked outside the community boundaries to avoid towing action. The letter specifically stated that this applied even to vehicles parked on private driveways within the subdivision. That's when I realized I had him exactly where I wanted him. You see, there was something Mr. Powertrip didn't know about my property. When my wife and I bought the house, we'd been very careful about the lot boundaries because we wanted to make sure we had enough space for both our cars and my truck. The realtor had shown us the survey, and we'd even had it verified during the inspection process. Our property extends significantly beyond what most people would assume. The driveway comes up from the street and curves around to a wider area behind the house where I usually park the truck. Most people probably assume that back area was part of the common space or maybe HOA property, but it's actually well within our lot lines. But here's the interesting part. Our lot actually extends beyond the official subdivision boundaries. When the neighborhood was developed, the builder had acquired several parcels of land and combined them into the subdivision. Our house happened to be built on a lot that included a strip of the original property that extended past the neighborhood's recorded boundaries. It's not unusual in developments like this, just a quirk of how the land was divided up. According to the survey, about 30 feet of our backyard, including a portion of the wider driveway area, is technically outside the subdivision boundaries. It's still our property, still part of our deed, but it's not subject to HOA authority because it's not within the community as legally defined. I'd never thought much about this detail before, but Mr. Powertrip's ridiculous demand gave me an idea. If he wanted my truck parked outside the community boundaries, I was happy to comply, maliciously. I called my lawyer and explained the situation. He loved it. We verified the exact boundaries using the recorded plat maps and confirmed that I could legally park my truck in the back part of my driveway that extended beyond the subdivision limits. Then I called a local paving company and had them extend my driveway. The new section was entirely on my property, but outside the HOA's jurisdiction. It was perfectly legal, didn't require any special permits, and gave me a designated parking area that met Mr. Powertrip's exact requirements. But I didn't stop there. Since I was already spending money on this ridiculous situation, I decided to make sure my compliance was as visible and obvious as possible. I had the paving company use a slightly different color of asphalt for the new section, creating a clear visual distinction between the driveway areas inside and outside the subdivision boundaries. Then I installed a small sign right at the boundary line that read, "Property line, end of HOA jurisdiction." Nothing obnoxious or offensive, just a simple factual statement that anyone could verify by looking at the recorded plat maps. Finally, I moved my truck to the new parking area, positioning it just outside the subdivision boundary but still clearly on my own property. The beauty of this setup was that my truck was now technically outside the community, exactly as Mr. Powertrip had demanded. But it was also more visible than it had ever been before. The new parking area was elevated slightly and positioned so that the truck was visible from multiple streets within the neighborhood. I made sure to send Mr. Powertrip a certified letter explaining that I had complied with his demands. I included copies of the survey maps showing the exact property boundaries and photos of the truck in its new location outside the subdivision limits. The first sign that my malicious compliance was working came about a week later. I was working on a project inside the house when my wife came in laughing. She'd been outside watering her plants when she saw Mr. Power Trip walking around our property with what looked like official documents in his hand. He'd apparently spent a good 20 minutes trying to figure out if my truck was violating any HOA rules in its new location. She watched him pace back and forth along the property line, looking confused and increasingly frustrated. The real fun started when other neighbors began to notice what I'd done. Word spread quickly that I'd found a way to comply with the HOA's demands while making the truck more prominent than ever. Several people stopped by to ask about the property line and the new parking area. It turned out that a lot of residents were getting tired of Mr. Power Trip's increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. My truck situation had just been the most visible example, but he'd been harassing people about all kinds of petty violations: lawn height, flower colors, mailbox designs, even the type of outdoor furniture people could use. The HOA's next monthly meeting was much more interesting than usual. Instead of the usual 15 people, nearly 40 residents showed up. Mr. Power Trip tried to run the meeting normally, but it was clear that public opinion had shifted significantly. When we got to the discussion of my truck, several residents spoke up in my defense. They pointed out that I had complied with the board's demands exactly as written, and that the truck was now parked outside the community boundaries as required. Mr. Power Trip tried to argue that my compliance was somehow inappropriate or against the spirit of the rules, but he couldn't point to any specific violation. The truck was legally parked on my own property, outside the HOA's jurisdiction, exactly where he demanded it be placed. But then came the real kicker. One of the neighbors, the woman who'd voted against the enforcement action at the previous meeting, had done some research of her own. She'd found out that several board members, including Mr. Power Trip himself, had vehicles that could arguably be considered commercial under his broad interpretation of the rules. Mr. Power Trip drove a large pickup truck that he used for a small landscaping business he ran on weekends. Another board member had a van with his wife's catering business logo on the side. A third had a boat trailer that was arguably larger and more intrusive than my work truck had ever been. When confronted with this information, Mr. Power Trip tried to claim that these situations were different, but he couldn't explain how. The inconsistent enforcement was obvious to everyone in the room. The meeting got pretty heated as more residents spoke up about their frustrations with the board's arbitrary enforcement tactics. Several people mentioned that they'd been considering selling their houses because the HOA had become so difficult to deal with. That's when someone made a motion to remove Mr. Power Trip as HOA president. I hadn't expected things to go that far, but the frustration in the room was palpable. When they took the vote, it wasn't even close. Mr. Power Trip was removed from his position by an overwhelming margin. The new board president was the woman who'd been doing research on the enforcement inconsistencies. One of her first acts was to suspend all pending enforcement actions, pending a comprehensive review of HOA policies and procedures. My truck case was officially closed, with the board acknowledging that I had complied with all reasonable interpretations of the covenants. They also issued a formal apology for the harassment I'd experienced and agreed to reimburse me for the legal fees I'd incurred. But the best part came a few months later. The new board decided to update the community covenants to make them clearer and more reasonable. As part of that process, they explicitly allowed work vehicles to be parked on private property as long as they were properly maintained and not used for storing hazardous materials. They also added language prohibiting arbitrary or discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules and established a clear appeals process for any future disputes. Mr. Power Trip, meanwhile, had become something of a pariah in the neighborhood. Word had gotten around about his inconsistent enforcement and heavy-handed tactics. Several residents who'd been on the receiving end of his harassment over other issues spoke up about their experiences. The final irony came when the new board decided to enforce the vehicle rules consistently. Mr. Power Trip received a violation notice for his own pickup truck, which technically violated his own interpretation of the commercial vehicle prohibition. He ended up having to park it in his garage and only use it for actual landscaping work, not as his daily driver. As for me, I eventually moved my truck back to its original spot in the main part of my driveway. The new board confirmed that it had never actually violated any reasonable interpretation of the covenants, and several neighbors mentioned that they'd gotten so used to seeing it that the neighborhood felt weird without it. I kept the extended driveway and the property line sign, though. They serve as a permanent reminder of what happens when petty tyrants try to abuse their limited authority. The sign has become something of a neighborhood landmark, with new residents often asking about the story behind it. The whole experience taught me a valuable lesson about standing up to bullies, even when they hide behind official titles and formal procedures. Mr. Deshu.org. Power Trip thought he could use his position to push around anyone who didn't fit his narrow vision of what the neighborhood should look like. Instead, His overreach backfired spectacularly. By demanding something ridiculous and putting it in writing, he gave me the perfect opportunity to comply in a way that exposed the absurdity of his position. The best part is that his own words were what brought him down. He couldn't argue that I was being unreasonable or violating any rules because I had done exactly what he demanded. His complaint wasn't that I hadn't complied. It was that I had complied too well. These days, the neighborhood is much more peaceful. The new HOA board focuses on actual community issues rather than petty power trips. Property values have remained stable, and we even had a couple of new families move in specifically because they heard the HOA was reasonable to work with. Mr. Power Trip still lives a few houses down, but he keeps to himself, mostly. Occasionally, I'll see him looking in my direction when I'm loading or unloading my truck, but he's never approached me again about parking issues. I think he learned the same lesson I did, just from the opposite perspective. Be careful what you ask for, because you just might get it. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you again tomorrow.